Hello, welcome to another podcast by the Glasgow University History Society. So today we're going to do something a bit different than we usually do. With each of us, there's four of us today, we've each come up with an alternate history theory. So we'll each be discussing each of those. So today you have me, John Hill.
You have me, Nathan McLaren.
You have me, Robbie Patterson.
And you have me, Callum Ferguson.
Awesome. So I suppose we'll jump right in. Nathan, do you want to start with yours?
Well, actually, I think Callum should get the opportunity to go first because I know fine well he has thought out his theory thoroughly.
Yeah,
I've not thought it out that thoroughly. But mine begins in 1895 with Oscar Wilde not pursuing a libel case against the Duke of Queensberry. Now, you're probably thinking, where is this going? But Wilde might then wind down his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, the man with whom he had a homosexual relationship with, to protect his family from further accusations of sodomy, etc., and to basically cover his public persona. At that point, Douglas would likely flee to the continent and sulk into some den of iniquity and some knocking shop in Paris. At that point, Wilde would likely retreat from the public eye for a while, and I have him re-emerging in 1897, publicly joining the Liberal Party and penning an editorial in the Manchester Guardian written, "Why I Believe in Liberal Socialism." A follow-up to his article or essay, which I think was something like "Man Under Socialism," because Oscar Wilde was in fact a socialist who still worked within the sort of liberal society of Asquith and Lloyd George. At that point, I then imagined him standing in the seat of Chelsea, where he lived in London, and in the 1900 election, the Tories had won the seat. But in this alternative 1900 election, Wilde wins the seat on a high turnout and has a significant enough majority. He immediately becomes a close ally of Asquith, sitting on the front bench, where, if any of you remember, roughly where Dennis Skinner used to sit, on the front bench, but not part of the government or opposition benches, making eloquent and very, very cutting, witty speeches in response to the now floundering Tory government of the early 1900s. He also becomes a close confidant of Campbell Bannerman and helps promote new liberalism throughout the country, penning many essays and possibly writing some plays which promote the ideas of new liberalism to the British public, thus helping the Liberals on a wider political scale. Of course, the Tory backbenches are infuriated that someone like Oscar Wilde is sitting in Parliament, and so there would be screams of sodomite ringing down from the Tory backbenches. I also had a little anecdote that in 1902, Balfour succeeded his uncle, Lord Roberts Gascoigne Cecil, the Marquis of Salisbury, which is where we get the phrase "Bob's your uncle" from, because Balfour was appointed by pure nepotism. And by the way, feel free to ask any questions as I go along. I imagined a heated exchange between the new Prime Minister Balfour and Wilde, where Wilde makes all of these accusations and criticisms of Balfour, and of course the clear nepotism. And I imagined Balfour in the sort of flustered way that he used to speak, supposedly. He might accuse Wilde of being an anarchist, which was quite an insult at the time. Although Wilde would likely have taken it in stride, because Oscar Wilde actually does have his place in the history of anarchism. There were arguments that he was a liberal socialist or a libertarian socialist, and there are other arguments to say that Oscar Wilde was in fact an anarchist or anarcho-socialist. Moving on, when Balfour resigns after attempting to sack Joseph Chamberlain, the leader of the Liberal Unionist Party, with which the Conservatives were in coalition, I imagined that it all blew up in their faces over the Tariff Reform Act, which was an attempt to create a sort of trade barrier to the empire. It was a form of mercantilism, and it was in the opposition to free trade. Liberals would likely have exploited this, and that led to the downfall of Balfour's government in 1905. But in this reality, the Liberal Unionists and the Tories formally split a coalition and stand against each other in the January 1906 election, to both of their parties' detriment. So moving on, I imagine the 1906 general election result wouldn't be too different from reality, except that the Tories would do even worse. I had the Liberals gaining many seats with 393, the Irish Parliamentary Party winning most of the seats in what is now the Republic of Ireland, winning 87, the Conservative Party winning just 84, the Liberal Unionist Party winning 68, the Labour Party winning 32, and there being a few independents. That would result in a government majority of 117. In 1907, I imagined Wilde would aid Asquith and Lloyd George in their constitutional reform. If you remember, he was a close friend of the Prince of Wales during the Victorian period, who later became Edward VII. This close relationship with Edward VII would have aided in any constitutional reform, because if you have the sovereign as a close friend, then you'd be able to reform government without too many problems. By removing the House of Lords' ability to block legislation, Wilde would pave the way for radical constitutional, economic and social reforms in line with new liberalism. At this point, I imagine Wilde would move on to being appointed the Chief Secretary of Ireland, tasked with passing Home Rule. I then imagined Wilde formulating a plan based upon his aesthetic principles and sort of romantic ideas about the provinces of Ireland, and creating a federal devolution system where the Parliaments of Connaught, Leinster and Munster would meet in Dublin, but the Parliament of Ulster would meet in Belfast, thus resolving the Catholic-Protestant issue there. That was actually the original plan of the Irish Government Act 1914, but which never came into place because of the First World War. I imagine these acts would pass with little opposition, and on the advice of Asquith, Wilde would be offered a peerage, but wouldn't take it, and would instead become a Knight Grand Cross of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath and become Sir Oscar Wilde. At that point, I imagined him being appointed Minister without portfolio and being Asquith's direct deputy in cabinet. I then imagined that because there hadn't been any constitutional crisis in 1910, there would have been no general elections at the time, and the Liberals would have been able to pursue their reforms with little opposition from the Conservatives. Thus, in the 1911 general election, the Liberals would return with a smaller majority, the Conservatives would recover, Labour would overtake the Parliamentary Party, and Liberal Unionists would sort of disappear, reducing the government majority to just 22. Now, it gets spicy here. In 1914, in response to the crisis in Belgium, Sir Oscar and other radicals threatened the Asquith ministry with walking out of government rather than going to war. Obligations to France made by Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, forced Britain into war. The Liberals split 295 to 48, and the government loses its majority. And most of the rebels follow Wilde and defect to the Labour Party. The new Labour MPs, led by Sir Oscar, pressured Asquith's government in 1915 into a coalition on condition that Britain pulls out of the war. After 9 months in Belgium and France, Britain leaves the First World War on condition made by Wilde and Ramsay MacDonald to agree a coalition in Britain. Thus, Britain becomes one of the most radically progressive countries in Europe, with a welfare state established during the First World War. Because if British Empire pulls out, they can concentrate on peacetime reforms rather than invest themselves in the conflict. The result on the continent, however, is that the Central Powers steamroll France and capture Paris by the end of 1915. And the world looks very different, because World War I ends after 2 years with the Central Powers winning a decisive victory, although I suppose conflict in Russia would continue for a while. I hadn't really gotten any further with that, but I just thought it was an interesting idea to play with, that Oscar Wilde might well have been one of the most important figures of the 20th century, if he had lived and if he'd gone into politics.
Yeah, you know when you said you hadn't thought it out. Well, I think
No,
you
I
may have
haven't.
just you have
Oh,
though.
is it like that scene? Is it like that scene in Back to the Future where Doc Brown shows this model of Hill Valley, which is just like bottles and paints and things, and he says, "Oh, it's just a crude model, but it's incredibly accurate and detailed."
Exactly.
And he mocked it up in a night, which is not to toot my own horn, but I made this up mostly yesterday and a bit today.
No,
Well, that's even well done.
That was the result of too much whiskey and an overactive imagination.
That's what Oscar Wilde used to say.
Exactly.
What was it that alcohol consumed in sufficient quantities results in all of the something of drunkenness?
It's because, well, we all know about Oscar Wilde, where he came from.
Everything in moderation, including moderation, was another thing he said.
I like the idea that Oscar Wilde was the hero that this country needed, but didn't deserve. I like that.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it though. I don't think that if he became an MP, he would have lasted though. I think he
No.
would have.
I think he would have pissed off his constituents too much.
Exactly.
Yeah, he's too out of the clique, isn't he? Especially with his pamphlet, "The Soul of Man Under Socialism."
That's the one I was thinking of earlier. I imagined writing a follow-up one about, man under liberal socialism or something as his pitch to join the Liberal Party.
Yeah, I think because that pamphlet raised a lot of rather subversive ideas, didn't it? So like private
that's
abolished and cooperation rather than competition.
Well, to let slip my own views on things, property is theft. So
here we go again.
Here
we go again.
I'm a connoisseur of Kropotkin and Proudhon and all those lovely chaps.
I think about it though, if Oscar Wilde had written Das Kapital, it would be a much more popular book than it currently is.
He would have written a novel.
Yes, the novel of Das Kapital.
Actually, here's a question. Would you say that Oscar Wilde could be argued to be a left-wing Benjamin Disraeli?
Yeah, I'd say so. Quite a far left Benjamin Disraeli, actually. Quite far left.
The Benjamin Disraeli this country needed but did not deserve. Instead, we got Benjamin Disraeli.
Whereas Benjamin Disraeli was the one that we deserved, not the one we needed. Then again, I do also like Disraeli. Maybe I'll do an alternate history where Disraeli joins the Radicals, or doesn't get into the Tory seat, but then follows Gladstone or something.
The thing I don't get about it though is, why is it that nobody seems to remember that Oscar Wilde is Irish?
I did. That's why I made
you did, yes.
of Ireland.
That's the thing. People don't think of him as being Irish, but he was very interested in the country that he grew up in. Surprisingly so.
Hence why I thought he would come up with a devolution plan that would have made a lot more sense.
Yes.
I mean, I think the biggest problem was that the Irish Parliamentary Party was not directly involved in the creation of a home rule government in Ireland.
That was the fault of John Redmond.
Well, the problem with the Irish Parliamentary Party is that they had the same attitude to Irish politics as the SNP have to Scottish politics. They won't work with bloody anyone.
Fair dues. Anyway, is that all we have to say about Oscar Wilde, beyond, of course, his brilliant plays that we haven't talked about yet?
Does anyone have any questions about history?
What's the long-term consequence of the Central Powers winning in Europe?
I hadn't actually thought of that, bugger.
Come on, Callum, you must have thought of that. You must have a whole 5 or 6 pages detailed on the post-European situation.
Well, I imagine that basically what would result is Belgium would, Britain would have agreed to an agreement, would have made an agreement where Western Belgium, about the faces of the sea, and Brussels would remain Belgium. Germany would have the rest, and Germany would have a few more départements of France. France would also be forced to have given over its African colonies outside of Algeria to Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would probably, or something similar to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, would have governed Eastern Europe. So basically, Germany would have about 5 satellite states, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would still have collapsed, and so would the Ottoman Empire. But I imagine that those empires would have collapsed as a matter of civil war within those countries, and the 1920s would have been a period of civil war in Eastern Europe. And a bit like how the 1890s and 1900s were a period of civil war in the Balkans. And Britain would have played a similar distant role. It would have been involved, but as a more of a mediating factor. And I imagine that the League of Nations and other things wouldn't have happened. And basically, post-Napoleonic 19th century ideas of foreign policy would have continued until the 1940s. And fascism would have emerged, but would have emerged under very different circumstances and wouldn't have thrived as much. And so the way that, say, you know how you had the communist parties in Western Europe, and even in the countries that fell to fascism, and then in the Cold War period, I think there would have been a similar thing with fascism, is that politics would have been a much wider spectrum. You would have had in the British Parliament, in the Reichstag, in the French National Assembly, you would have had communists and fascists in their parliament. Basically, the whole of Europe would have looked like Weimar Germany, but a bit more stable and with post-Napoleonic foreign policy. And also, I imagine the period of imperialism would have continued up until the present day, because there would have been no earth-shattering conflict, because that pressure valve would have been open just long enough to let out the steam of the First World War, but closed before it actually started to heat the room up.
That's also what I was about to ask, is like the long-term impacts of these changes to the First World War on colonialism as a whole, because the First World War definitely shattered Germany's idea of having overseas colonies, which, ironically, one of the major members of Germany's founders, Bismarck, was strongly anti getting involved in places like Africa purely because it would serve no real purpose for Germany. But now you've got this sort of outward expansive bent towards Africa. How are civil rights movements and how are anti-colonial movements going to be treated? I imagine quite harshly, considering the general authoritarian bent of the Central Powers.
Well, I was going to say, the German approach to rebellion in Belgium was social punishment. If one person rebelled in a village, the whole village would be put to the bayonet.
Right.
That was where the propaganda image of the Belgian baby on the pickle hub as Spike came about, was because what would happen is if one group of Belgians or French in a village occupied by the Germans rebelled in some way, the entire village would be punished, because that was the Prussian view of military discipline. It's almost like decimation. If ancient Roman decimation.
Yeah, you'd kill every 10th man in line, no matter who was actually guilty of committing the crime. You'd punish the entire unit so that people would be much more likely to shun failure and much less likely to incur it.
Indeed. I imagine that the world would be simultaneously a more peaceful but a more internally repressive place.
So I suppose our takeaway from all this is that Oscar Wilde, the man who saved Britain and doomed thousands of Belgian babies, what a monster. Okay, well, I suppose we better move on. So John, Robbie, any of you want to go next? I know you've thought about this extensively and you've both got brilliant scenarios.
Do you want to go first, Robbie?
I think
you look keen.
Robbie looks keen, so Robbie will go next.
All right. I have, within the confines of today, pulled out of my arse the idea that Scotland should not have probably tried to colonise a bit of the world that was already owned by the Spanish. The Darien scheme in the... the Darien scheme in the 17th century was a Scottish colonial policy which decided to invest a significant, up to around 20% of the nation's wealth in colonising a bit of the New World that was already owned by Spain. the colony of Darien, which failed, unsurprisingly, due to a mixture of poor planning, no real resupply, English interference and prevention of help to the colony, and, well...
The fact the land was owned by Spain.
Yeah, and the land was owned by the Spanish.
Well, this isn't the only time in history that Scots have tried to colonise a bit of Spain. I mean, the people of Ibiza and Magaluf have had to put up with that for the last 40 years.
Why?
That scheme's actually been more successful and cheaper.
Notably cheaper.
Instead of this scramble for Africa now, there's a scramble for Ibiza because it's rife with German tourists as well.
Oh, see what you did there.
Was that a link back to colonialism?
Oh yeah,
I see what you did there.
Colonialism. But I do believe that if Scotland had not colonised Darien, this tiny wee part of modern-day Panama, it would be significantly more wealthy, perhaps enough to resist the Acts of Union. Because one of the major consequences of the Darien scheme was having Scotland's credit rating absolutely buggered. It was utterly eradicated. But it would have made Scotland more financially secure and able to carry on as a, if not independent nation, a nation under personal union with Britain rather than being a direct component, which could have vast consequences on the structure of the United Kingdom as a whole. You could have a compartmentalized monarchy rather than, well, a single country. Sort of like a longer-lasting Denmark-Norway, where areas have a large degree of administrative autonomy on their own affairs. Unless, of course, you're talking about Ireland, which would have probably still been under the yoke. And this could, in turn, have numerous consequences in Scotland itself. For example, it puts the question of the Scottish Enlightenment drastically under threat, because part of the Scottish Enlightenment was Scotland's resources were no longer being focused on perpetuating Scotland as a nation, and instead were being disseminated through the free trade agreement with England and general increase in wealth that was brought on by the Union to help Scotland focus more on academic pursuits and economic pursuits rather than try and perpetuate itself as a world power or any sort of power. So it's possible that Scotland, although still existing, could be slightly worse off, but would also be freer because of the fact that it would not be absorbed directly into the United Kingdom. And we'd see the United Kingdom today persisting on a much less centralised model, which at least I would argue would probably be preferable for the people here.
Mm. Well, we must say that's a controversial question, given the city we live in.
Hi. So, what do you guys think? Do you think that the Darien scheme, or not embarking to colonise a part of Spain, would have had this impact on Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole?
I was just going to say, I think that the Great Britain, the Kingdom of Great Britain, as a concept, and the Act of Union specifically, was sort of inevitable for many other reasons. The Darien scheme was a sort of catalyst for it. But I would argue that securing the revolutionary monarchy, securing the Hanoverian succession based on Protestant rule, was probably a bigger factor. That basically, first of all, Scottish aristocrats wanted to get involved in English politics, and second of all, they wanted to make sure that the succession through the Hanoverian line was secure after the death of Queen Anne. Now, of course, when the Darien scheme was launched, Queen Anne was not on the throne, but there was a clear succession going on there, and they wanted to make sure that the Protestant reformed non-absolute monarchy was secured. And if you had one country possibly having the option for a pretender to the throne by having two separate sovereign states in Scotland and England, you had the potential for another civil war. And I think that the union was inevitable at the time for purely political reasons. So I think the Darien scheme, if it hadn't been undertaken, would have delayed union by 20 years.
See, I'm thinking if they were going to colonise a part of Spain, obviously it has to be Majorca. Now imagine that if they'd sunk all those resources into taking the island of Majorca, and then instead of setting up a trading post, they set up a nightclub. and then maybe grew that into a chain of nightclubs across the island, that would have attracted business from all over Europe, make it a sort of a free port. And that would have improved Scotland's economy massively, and that would have been more valuable than the entire Scottish economy up to that point. So, you think about it, the idea was sound, the location was just misguided.
You know what the problem though is? Knowing Scottish politics and Scottish economics at the time, they would all the nightclubs would have been called Campbell's.
Well, why not?
Never trust the Campbell.
The Campbells could have gone into nightclubs instead of making soup.
Wait,
Or murdering McDonald's.
or murdering McDonald's, that's true.
Well, think about it. McDonald's could have been founded by an actual Scotsman rather than by an Americanized Scotsman.
True. You could have had the House of MacDonald and the House of Campbell, these two clans, diversify from regional warfare into business warfare.
What? And instead of having Disney and Warner Brothers, we instead had Campbell and McDonald Brothers.
I should probably explain, in case there's English students listening to this podcast, they're talking about the Scottish clans. Because when I first came to the Uni of Glasgow, I had no idea about Scottish history, so I think it's worth noting that.
Don't worry, John. Nobody actually listens to this podcast, English or otherwise.
Think of it like Game of Thrones in kilts.
Exactly.
The only way to improve Game of Thrones, other than minus the last 4 seasons.
Well, that's really only half a Game of Thrones. That's only game.
That's what we need to do.
Well, that is a good one, actually.
Yeah, it is.
But still, the other main improvement to the Game of Thrones television program would have been writing.
Well, include some writing.
Include some.
Not just tits and dragons. Unfortunately, for many viewers of Scottish history, there are significantly fewer tits and dragons available. So if you are more into that side of things and history side of things, maybe stick with Game of Thrones and just sort of, if you want to do some of the research here and there, there's the Black Dinner, the Breaking of the Black Douglas, and...
Well, that's a name for it. That's a name for maybe a Scottish restaurant, the Black Dinner.
Aye, it would work well. It's one of the, to get quite off topic, it's one of the main, it's the event that inspired the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, was this dinner where the Clan Douglas was not wiped out, but chastised by the king with the execution of 2 of their members, and it's been very dramatised in history as a whole.
I mean, I really think that there should be a pub called the Red Common.
There is a pub called the Red Common in Cumbernauld.
There is?
Yeah, it's in Kildrum.
Oh, that explains it.
Oh no, but now we've really lost all our viewers. All our viewers who don't live in Cumbernauld.
Come on,
which I suspect will be all of them. The Red Common is a pub. And the only incident I remember from that pub is I once heard tell of a guy who got thrown out of the pub for fighting. He came back and attacked them with a bit of carpet pull. You know the nail? I don't know what you call it. You know the nail, the sort of length of wood with nails that they use to anchor a carpet at the bottom of stairs. He managed to rip that out of the bottom of the stairs, came back and wielded it as a weapon.
That's dedication. And for those of you not from Scotland, when you picture Cumbernauld, just picture Mordor from Lord of the Rings.
but with Soviet architecture.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Well, Cumbernauld.
Or if you're from the Uni of Glasgow, just imagine an entire town that looks like the Boyd Ord building and the Queen Margaret.
That's a really good description.
It is. It's a scarily good description.
It's so sad.
The biggest Glasgow Uni alternate history I can think of is what if the Boyd Ord didn't get cladding?
No, what if the Boyd Ord hadn't been built?
Would there be a University of Glasgow? That's the question.
I think there would have probably ended up being there probably would have ended up being a cult of the Joe Black building.
Or the Adam Smith building.
Oh,
well, there's already a cult of the Adam Smith building.
Why does nobody talk about the Adam Smith building? Okay, I think we better move on before we get violently off topic.
Right, on to John's alternate
John.
history. Please bring us back to Earth.
Bring the tone of the conversation up.
Right, in other news, um, my alternate history theory is whether what would happen if Hitler had bypassed Stalingrad on the Volga in Operation Barbarossa. So the aim of my alternate history suggestion is to spark a debate amongst us to sort of discuss the significance of the Battle of Stalingrad in reality, in our reality, and whether avoiding this battle, whether Hitler could have won the Second World War and vanquishing the Soviet Union and win the war through Operation Barbarossa. So to kickstart this discussion, I'll sort of recount the reality of what actually happened with the invasion of the Soviet Union. So in 1941, the Nazis invaded Russia in three army groups. Army Group North that went to besiege Leningrad, Army Group Center, which went on to Moscow, Army Group South, which went through Ukraine to Kiev. They did the same as what they did in France. They blitzkrieged it across. Once Army Group Center got to Smolensk, Army Group South had trouble in Kiev, so Army Group Center went down to help and aid them overcome to take Kiev, and then Hitler changed his mind with the route, so he decided to go down to the oil fields in the Caucasus, and that's where we essentially get a big fuck up with the Battle of Stalingrad. So
How many men were involved in the Battle of Stalingrad? Wasn't it like 2 million? Like you basically poured a small European country into one city, and then just threw them in the meat grinder. It was like Verdun on steroids.
Yeah.
British colonial policy.
Yeah. So just to jumpstart the discussion for us all to discuss, I thought of some factors to consider. So if Hitler had bypassed Stalingrad on the Volga to cut off Soviet armies down in the south in the Caucasus by securing the Volga north of Stalingrad, he would have avoided this great grand battle in Stalingrad. And then my idea is that he could have gone on to Moscow and secured Soviet Russia from there on. Obviously, he could also support a heavier attack on the siege of Leningrad as well in the north. So I think he had a fighting chance in actually toppling over the Soviet Union.
No, there's a problem there. All of Soviet industry, or a lot of Soviet industry, had already been moved east at that point, and the Soviets would, if I know that the furthest in reality that the Wehrmacht got to Moscow was the outer ring of the subway system. And my argument is that at that point, if they had breached that sort of outer ring, probably what would have happened is Soviet leadership, I think, probably wasn't even in Moscow at the time. They probably would have done what they did in 1812 and razed Moscow to the ground and moved towards the Urals. And I think that what they would have done is by moving industry back and by pulling out of the major cities and starting essentially a guerrilla campaign. Yes, the Soviet Union's internal political structure would have been damaged beyond repair at the time. They wouldn't have toppled the Soviet Union and conquered it formally. It's possible that the Nazis might have thought that by capturing Moscow. I think also Leningrad would have held out because the way that it was being resupplied. Yes, the city was completely in the siege. The city was completely surrounded. But the problem was the Finns in the north and the Germans in the south and the east. They didn't take into account the massive lake right next to Leningrad, and that was how the city was being resupplied. It's true that they did get down to eating each other in Leningrad, and I think that Leningrad would have eventually fallen, but I think it could have held out until 1943-44. And I think that what would have happened is what happened in Stalingrad would have happened in Leningrad.
That's an interesting idea because one of the factors I was going to say is that you mentioned the guerrilla campaign that the Soviets would have done. So that's another factor. So like learning from the mistakes with the Napoleon's campaign in 1812. So obviously once they took Moscow, after Napoleon took Moscow, the Tsar started a guerrilla force against Napoleon by burning the city, and obviously you know the rest. But another factor was that I think another problem with the theory that I came up with is that Hitler's arrogance that actually took Stalingrad in the first place just because of its name and its rather minor strategic value.
I believe it did have a degree of industrial value.
Yeah, because I think they were producing quite a lot of industry for the Soviet Union as a whole, manufacturing.
Tractors, and I think rubber as well.
There were more strategic areas to take, weren't there?
I also think that they would have had difficulty actually taking the Caucasus. Like they could have resupplied. I think that the Germans could have resupplied in Sochi, but by using the Black Sea.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I actually think they would have had difficulty taking the oil fields in the Caucasus because of resistance from the Azerbaijanis, the Georgians, and possibly getting Turkey on the side of the Allies. Because I'm not right, Turkey was on the side of the Allies.
So do you think another problem with that would be the German forces was too thinned out? Because initially with the discussions with Operation Barbarossa just before they invaded, a lot of the problems that the generals had and were obviously quite silent about because it was Hitler who was above them, but is that they were worried they were far too thinned out, they were too far away from each other?
Well, I would argue that we probably would have ended up in a situation where they would have been even more thinly spread out, because if they'd taken Moscow, no doubt what they would have done is purely from Hitler's ego, they would have expanded through, once they'd captured Moscow, they would have expanded through as much Soviet territory as possible, probably trying to move on to Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod and Kazan, which is actually even further east than Volgograd. And I think they would have tried to push to the Urals to basically. They would have tried to push as far east as possible, so that they would have claimed as much land as possible for their own internal propaganda campaign. Because to hold that much land, they would have had to sacrifice probably another 1 million men on top of the ones they already sacrificed, trying to capture the territory. Because they would have been over 2,000 miles from Berlin at that point.
Well, I think that the Soviet morale might have been significantly undermined with the capture of Moscow, and obviously even a hold on the Caucasus, no matter how tenuous, does bring in more oil into the German war machine, something that was crucially lacking at that point in the war, and something that definitely would give their armour and aircraft a boost in the fight against the Allies. It's also possible, I'm fairly certain that Stalin did stay in Moscow for the Battle of Moscow, and I don't think, it seems unlikely that he'd retreat from Moscow, because for all of Stalin's faults,
no, he definitely made plans to retreat from Moscow.
What were the plans?
To retreat to Novgorod. You don't confirm it. I'm under the impression that the Soviet plan was that if Moscow was captured, the Soviet leadership would have retreated to somewhere like Novgorod. They would have retreated another few hundred miles east, and another few hundred miles west, and so on. Because if the Soviet leadership got captured, then the ability for organized resistance would be damaged. My view is that there is probably no way for the German army to actually take Russia or to take the Soviet Union without conquering the entire territory. And even then, they would have still had internal flare-ups. Capturing the Soviet leadership would have been a major blow, much more major than anything we've talked about. But my argument is that the Soviet leadership, and maybe I'm being too nice to them, but I think the Soviet leadership was savvy enough to know that they should have retreated. If the lines of retreat were shrinking. You know, they would have realised, maybe not right away, but they probably would have realised by the time that the Germans cannon or guns or heavy artillery, by the time the German artillery was able to hit the Kremlin, they would have left. Although the chances of the Germans actually getting artillery to Moscow was limited.
Considering the general difficulty with resupplying the area in the first place. What about the impact on Soviet morale, though, for having the capital city taken? In a time, for example, the time of the Tsars, the people's opinion effectively did not matter when it came to Napoleon's conquest of Russia. But we found that in the First World War, this was rapidly changing. And that under immense pressure, the Soviet people, or the Russian people at that time, and later the Soviet people, were then definitely taking an interest in resisting mass devastation to their land brought via war. So was it potentially possible that with the collapse of Moscow, there could have been a general attitude shift towards surrender and not fighting until complete annihilation? I think the only way you could maybe achieve that is maybe reducing the zealotry of the Nazis.
The other thing we should probably mention on a serious note is that if this had happened, if this alternate history had happened, I still think that Nazism would have been defeated, but it would have taken a lot longer, and tens of millions more Soviet citizens would have died, both in concentration camps, as slave labourers, and in the actual conflict itself as military casualties. Probably, I think the death toll for World War II is about 100 million. I think it would have been, let me just double check. The overall casualty is believed to be 70 to 85, estimation is 70 to 85 million. I would have thought that at that time, in this alternate history, the death toll would have probably been closer to 150 million, nearly double, because of the sheer number of Soviet citizens who would have both been involved in civil unrest, disobedience, slave labour, concentration camps, and the Holocaust. Because the Nazis would have occupied large sections of Russia for 3 or 4 years, possibly 5 or 6. If you lengthen the Second World War by any amount of time, then Japan's atrocities in China would have continued.
Just a quick addendum to that, Stalin did indeed make plans to evacuate the Soviet leadership from Moscow in October of 1941. And he also made plans to evacuate Lenin's body from its mausoleum in 1941. So there you are.
Oh, thank God.
What would we do without Lenin's body?
Because we all know that at some point Lenin is going to smash through the glass case and say, "Must crush capitalism," as he wanders around as a zombie.
Simpson's approach to history.
It's not a bad approach.
No, it's the best approach. The only approach we need is zombie Lenin stomping about.
No, I still prefer post-revisionism. Anyway, that was my thoughts on your alternate history, John. Sorry if they went a bit far.
Here's another question I was going to add. With Zhukov's counterattack, Hitler told General Paulus to remain where he was in Stalingrad. But what if he had broken through and broken away? Do you think there would have been a retreat as it was at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad through Kursk and so on? Or do you reckon...
If they had pulled away in retreat earlier in the battle, they would have likely followed the same route. It's just that part of me thinks that the less worn down they were, you know how if an army routes, it is actually faster than if an army retreats. I feel like the more men and munitions you pull out of an area, the slower it is as a logistical challenge. The way that the Nazis fled, or the Wehrmacht fled from Stalingrad at the end of the battle, that was quite a fast retreat, wasn't it? I mean, it was still probably weeks. Yeah. My point is, I think that a calculated pulling out of Stalingrad would probably have actually been slower and possibly more destructive, because pulling out, even a fighting retreat still is damaging to any campaign. Ask the Australians at Gallipoli.
That's a good example. Yeah.
Or there's another example. I can't remember what it was. The Battle of Dunbar in the 1630s or 40s, when the Covenanters were conquered.
Yeah, that's basically my one. Nathan, do you want to start yours?
So the question I'm asking is, what if Napoleon lost at the Battle of Jena, Auerstadt? Now, in our real history, Jena was one of Napoleon's seminal triumphs. Arguably brought him to the height of his power in continental Europe. Humiliating defeat for the Prussians. The aftermath of Battle of Prussia was essentially reduced to a satellite state of the French Empire. It was forced to accept a number of French garrisons across the territory. And in a way it brought Napoleon up to the borders with Russia, which would eventually lead to his attempted invasion of the country, and we all know how that happened. But what would have happened if Napoleon had lost at Jena? Now, I'm thinking that, say if Prussia had gone to war with Napoleon, but had secured a good coalition against him, and they'd won this miraculous victory over the great general at Jena, Napoleon, being sensible, probably would have consolidated his empire rather than tried to expand. Imagine if, instead of pushing it further and further east, he stopped where he was, consolidated a French empire consisting of about 3/4 of the Italian peninsula, the Confederation of the Rhine, and the Low Countries. The way I'm thinking is eventually he would have called a truce with Wellington and Iberia, probably declared the peninsula to be neutral ground, and in fact he would have created this Western European superstate and restored a kind of balance in Europe. Now, in real life, Napoleon divorced Josephine and married Marie Louise of Austria. And I'm thinking, if he'd done this in the alternate history, it would have represented a kind of imperial alliance between the Napoleonic family and his empire and the Habsburgs, which I see as kind of like an alternate version of the Central Powers. Now, Prussia may save itself at Jena, but Napoleon would still be in control of most of modern-day Germany. So rather than trying to expand southward and westward, as Prussia did in real life, what would happen if the Prussian kings had turned their attention northward? I imagine that maybe 20 years afterwards, Prussians would start attacking Denmark-Norway, which had been a Napoleonic ally. And much like what the Prussians were able to the Danish in real history in the Second Schleswig War, they conquer and absorb Denmark-Norway, and then maybe later on they launch another war against Sweden, which I'm confident they would win because Prussia was an excellent military state and Sweden was a second-rate power. So what they've created essentially is a northern-centric, Lutheran and somewhat Germanic super kingdom. Prussia creates this northern kingdom, allied with Russia and eventually allied with Britain. Now, because Napoleon dominates in Europe, Britain has concentrated its attention on starting its overseas empire out with Europe. So we've got our alternate Central Powers and our alternate Triple Entente. And to me, that would be the basis of the First World War in this new timeline. Anyway, that's about as far as I got.
My first immediate question would be, do you think that Germany would have actually stood for French sphere of influence? Or do you not think that Prussia would have been able to ally the German states within the French Empire, or satellite states of the French Empire, in revolt? And it wouldn't have expanded into Scandinavia, but would have concentrated on liberating German states from French rule and created another series of conflicts in Central Europe, trying to create a unified German state in opposition to the French Empire. And that France would have controlled Western and Southern Europe, and Germany would have controlled the Northern and Eastern Europe on the European continent, not counting Scandinavia. And that Britain would have remained the premier naval power independent and neutral.
Yes, I mean, that was the issue for Napoleon, was Britain's domination of the seas. Yes, now Prussia probably would have attempted to break French control in the Rhine. I imagine over the decades it probably would have expanded into what we would call North Rhine-Westphalia, maybe taken the north coast, so there would have been a continual dispute here. But imagine the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg and Baden. Now, being Catholic, they probably wouldn't have particularly wanted Prussian rule, and they didn't want Prussian rule in our timeline either. They may well have seen French domination as a way to avoid being dominated by Berlin. So if you think about it, Prussia might have eventually succeeded in creating a North German Confederation come the time that the First World War happened in real history.
Well, that answers my question.
Don't you think that Britain and Russia, they would all sort of create a coalition just as it did after Napoleon won the Battle of Vienna?
Yeah, probably.
They would have been quite, well, they'd be surrounded for a start, and, well, relatively.
Yeah, relatively speaking.
And more sanctions as well, and that would be worse because Napoleon has less sway over the continent.
Yeah, I mean, basically the thought is, what if Napoleon had been less ambitious?
I think he'd definitely secure large swathes of Western Europe, as you said, but I don't know. I don't think it'd be as effective because for the reason.
Also, there is also the War of the Fifth Coalition, which was formed before the collapse of the continental system and the invasion of Russia.
Yeah, that's a good point.
No, exactly. So basically the thought was, what if Napoleon was essentially a different kind of person to what he was in real history?
See, that's my problem with these kind of histories, is we're assuming that people who acted in a specific way based on their personality would act in a different way. It's like all the what if Hitler didn't invade Russia histories.
Well, again, I mean, that's the whole point. The reason why Hitler invaded Russia is because Hitler had a very particular way of doing things. I mean, even if he hadn't, Hitler probably would have foundered on some other ridiculous plan.
I think it comes down to looking at Napoleon's personality. So, like, as you said, Hitler, I think he was just a megalomaniac in his expansion, just to prove some distorted fabrication about the Aryan supremacy. But with Napoleon, it was different. What do you reckon about his character that contributed to him expanding so far across Europe? Like, what would have driven him to do that?
I mean, I think
it was a Roman compulsion.
Exactly, Napoleon basically
conquered an empire in self-defense.
Yeah, he wants to control the area immediately out with his sphere of influence, and eventually that just expands and expands and expands. There's no end to it.
That was the same thing with Rome, is that once Rome expanded outside of Italy, it realised, well, now that we've expanded outside of Italy, all of the surrounding states are potential threats. So we'll expand into those states by conquering Carthage and Greece and Transalpine Gaul. And then at that point, you're like, well, we've got Northern Gaul, Germania Magna, Iberia. Well, they already had Iberia at that point. But then we've also got the Parthians. So, yeah, at that point, and then once you got to once Caesar got to the English Channel, well, there are all those Britons. What are we going to do with them? So we invade Britain. And then what are we going to do on the Rhine? We're going to invade Magna Germania and conquer halfway to Berlin, or where Berlin would be founded. Obviously, the Roman Empire encountered other problems and did actually stop expanding at one point. But the point is, what Napoleon did in the early 19th century is exactly what the Roman Empire did in the 1st century BC, the 1st century AD, and the 2nd century AD.
And that's why Hegel referred to him as the spirit of world history on horseback. And in his own lifetime...
Is that a reference to the David portrait?
Yeah, yes. Yes, it is.
Good.
And in his own lifetime, he encompassed a lifetime of many great empires. The whole point is, like any great empire, eventually he ran out of energy. Or he ran out of luck. Which in his mind would have the two things were intricately linked together. Much like how Rome eventually ran out of energy as well.
Didn't he say that I hate a general that does not have luck?
Exactly.
And I heard that joke in terms of a job interview, that that a person doesn't want to hire someone who isn't lucky, so he shuffled all the CVs, parted the deck, took half of them, and put half in the bin immediately. Said, "I'm only going to hire someone who's lucky." My point, however, about Napoleon was, would we all agree that Napoleon is the product of the French Revolution?
In some ways, yes.
I think... have any of you heard of Starkey's law?
I've not.
Well, we've all heard of David Starkey.
Careful. He's a very controversial figure.
Starkey's law of revolution is that every social revolution since 1789 has recreated the worst aspects, different aspects, but always the worst aspect of the Ancien regime. The French Revolution, the German Revolution, the Belgian Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the proletarian revolutions of the 20th century, and even now the social revolutions are in many ways recreating specific aspects of the Ancien regime, which precipitated the first major revolution of the modern world in France. And that all politics since 1789 has been a series of responses to 1789.
In some respects, that is true.
To say
I don't know
Starkey,
if it has quite the same universality as Starkey would suggest, but
to say that
in some
Starkey is
respects,
reductionist, yes. To say that Starkey is reductionist is an understatement.
Well, that's exactly how he thinks all the time. I mean, you get some general rule and then you apply it to absolutely everything. But yes, in some respects, that is true.
The interesting thing about this specific alternate history with regards to the French Revolution is I think there's definitely a chance that would inspire a secondary revolutionary wave. Because if Napoleon did run out of steam and was still left with a lot of what were viewed as by radical revolutionaries in France as counter-revolutionary forces on all sides, then it'd rather be like in a very Trotskyist Russia, having someone like Stalin come in and then try and enforce the idea of socialism in one country. I don't think that the people would want the revolution to stay stationary. I could see Napoleon, if he did not keep conquering, being overthrown internally having perhaps the establishment of a new republic, because there was this revolutionary zeal that was incredibly uncompromising in many ways.
Like the establishment of perhaps a military coup against Napoleon by the generals, and the generals established an oligarchical republic, militaristic oligarchical republic.
I think that's quite unlikely, because a lot of them were related, and a lot of them were quite Bonapartists themselves. Like the military became Napoleonic veterans after 1815.
Actually, you're right about that. I think any potential revolution would have taken a generation, because when you think about it, look at the 100 Days.
Yeah, exactly.
Napoleon had 1,000 men at the start of it. Was it 1,000 men or 100 men when he arrived on the French mainland? And by the time he reached Paris, he had the military.
Yeah.
That was how much loyalty he had.
Exactly.
At that point, you could make the argument that until Napoleon I died, there would have been no way of re-establishing a republic. I think there would have been a succession crisis, because Napoleon II was weak, and Napoleon III hadn't been born yet, or was a child. And I think what would have happened is France would have had a very, very brief succession crisis where they would have established a new Napoleonic successor. It's possible they might have even elected an emperor, because the generals and the old guard, is it the old guard? Is that the name of his leadership? They would have basically acted like the Praetorians and would have likely promoted one of the generals. Either they would have promoted Napoleon II, or they'd promoted one of the generals to being emperor, or they would have agreed not to have a single man rule, and instead would have remained fiercely loyal to Napoleon, but would have restored the Republic.
Here's a red herring, or not red herring, a wild card. What if Napoleon had founded his own religion? Say, for instance, he took, what was it? The cult of the Supreme Being, and somehow managed to take the idea...
Declared himself the Supreme Being.
Yes, he co-opted it for himself, turned it into... Yeah, exactly. And imagine if he'd somehow...
syncretized it with Christianity.
Exactly. And he used that to cement his rule. I wonder.
It would have been a second Reformation.
Exactly, a second Napoleonic Reformation.
It would have been the French Revolution and the Protestant Reformation combined. France would have essentially become Protestant country. But it would have been the cult of the Supreme Being.
Or better yet, he conquers his way down to Rome, and then he kicks out the Pope from the Vatican and takes up
declares himself Pope.
Yes, exactly. Pope of his own religion. He seizes...
That was actually... You could argue that was a mistake on Napoleon's part for not making himself Holy Roman Emperor.
I mean, he had the opportunity to do so.
He nearly did kick the Pope out.
I think this would not work because Napoleon's power rested on an authoritarian militarism. It wasn't... It was mildly...
Could you not have reinforced the authoritarian militarism with religious zealotry?
No, because during the French Revolution, we see this repudiation of all systems of repression. So it was a worse, more detrimental Reformation for them, and I don't think religion would have stuck, in my opinion.
Well, it didn't stick. No one supports the cult of the Supreme Being anymore.
I love the idea, though, Napoleon is the head of his own religion. I just think it's a brilliant thought.
I like the idea of Napoleon basically becoming the God Emperor from 40k. God Emperor Napoleon.
On his golden throne.
A golden throne made from the remnants of Prussian Pickelhaube.
Have any of you read a series of books called Dune?
Yep.
I've started reading the first one. I didn't get through it.
Are you saying basically Napoleon would turn into a giant worm?
Yes, that's how it should end.
Alternate history: Napoleon attaches himself to a sand trout and becomes the 3,000-year living God Emperor of the universe.
Somebody should write a novel with that as the
premise.
As the premise. What a wonderful ending to his life, though.
Well, if he had conquered the Catholic Church and hadn't installed a cult as a supreme being, I could imagine Napoleon being beatified and canonized in Catholicism and becoming Saint Napoleon.
What would his attributed miracle be?
Battle of Austerlitz.
That's not miracle, that's just good planning.
Battle of Vienna.
Why not? Saint Napoleon of Vienna.
Well, no, surely he would have been Saint Napoleon of Corsica.
Yeah, but he didn't like Corsica.
Well, he had a thick Corsican accent.
Corsica didn't really like Napoleon.
Corsica hated Napoleon, so why would he associate himself with
spite?
Spite, okay. He wasn't a very spiteful person, though.
Tell that to Russia. I mean, with the collapse of the continental system, that's basically invading a country out of spite, just marching on in because they refuse to follow a didactic trade policy.
The God Emperor Napoleon. I love the idea.
It's a good one, that.
It's a shame it wouldn't work. Just saying.
Well, I figure that's like Napoleon III. I don't think's touched on enough. A lot of people think Napoleon III was this sort of basically second-class Napoleon act. But if you accept his foreign policy, he was actually a very good ruler. So imagine he wasn't a foreign policy moron and actually managed to.
Well, that's what I'm saying. A man's only a good ruler until he's being marched into a German prisoner of war camp, at which point he ceases to be any ruler at all.
I just thought of something. We were speaking about the loyalty of the army to Napoleon and how that was quite very strong. But don't you think it's interesting that they're so devoted to him despite his abandoning them, like the real Napoleonic veterans after the Egyptian campaign?
He was an unusual guy, though. He had an odd charisma that any great leader needs.
Yeah, I suppose.
I think the thing is, I think one of the things he said himself is he could get away with things that other men couldn't, Things that just wouldn't work for anybody else worked for him. I think that's a big part of his success.
Yeah, it's just pure luck.
Yeah.
Napoleon's career should have, by all rights, died with the Egyptian campaign because he led a countless number of Frenchmen to their deaths, and then ran away with his tail between his legs.
As well as his mate's mummified heart.
Yeah.
You hear the story about Napoleon and going inside the pyramid and...
Yeah.
I wonder what he did. I wonder what he thought there.
What if he
I'm just back.
Activated some sort of pharaonic trap in the pyramids and locked himself in a pyramid for all eternity?
I mean, that would have been very Indiana Jones.
That's a good idea for a film, Napoleon versus the Mummy.
Okay, right. Next time we do another alternate history podcast, which I hope will be slightly less regular in the history channels.
I will be.
We should one of us should explore the idea of Napoleon fighting an army of mummies.
Well, that could be our segment on our ghost finding show when we eventually go the way of the History Channel and start producing nonsense.
Well, if we're going to do ghost finding, should we invite Greta Thunberg's mum? No. Greta Thunberg's mum did Eurovision. I was thinking of Simone Hertz, who's a roboticist. Her mum did ghost finding programs in Sweden. And the only reason I know that is because I watch Swedish television when I'm in Sweden.
We could also do Eurovision.
We could always do the.
Oh, you mean like that episode of Father Ted where they have to write a song for the Irish entry in Eurovision?
Well, the thing is, Ireland is arguably the most competitive European Eurovision country. They've won more Eurovisions than any other country, and one Irish guy has won it 3 times, twice on his own and once as part of a band, and he's called the King of Eurovision. But I do think a history of Eurovision is in order.
History of Eurovision, and we end by composing our own Eurovision song. Do any of you play any instruments?
I used to play the bagpipes.
Okay, we got bagpipes.
You know I used to play the xylophone.
We got bagpipes, we got a xylophone. John, did you play anything?
Well, in primary school, I was the kid who did the triangle, so that's something.
We got a bagpipe, we got a triangle, we got a xylophone, I play the bass, so somehow we'll make something out of those 4 components.
It may not be a good thing,
we need a lyricist.
Well,
a singer.
I like singing. I'm not particularly good at it, but you know.
Sometimes sing, but you can't sing and play the bagpipes at the same time. Eurovision songs have to be played live. So we've got the xylophone, the bass, the triangle, and lyrics.
I could be the lyricist. I write a good song.
I mean,
I could write a nice beat tune.
Wait, are we still recording?
Yes, we are. This is.
Oh yeah. This is all part of the pod. Well, to be fair, this podcast is basically a chatting shit about history podcast.
Exactly. We all need to do it at some time.
Wait, can I plug something then?
Yes,
It's not
plug
something
away.
the plug isn't for me. The plug is for a hardcore history podcast, which every
Wait a
history
minute.
graduate.
Are these guys going to take views away from us? Because if so, you can't be
No.
doing that, Callum. You can't
No,
be.
no. This is an alternative.
Okay.
This is a supplementary. Trust me, they upload even less regularly than we do. The last one was like 6 months ago. But the
Okay,
thing
we
is,
don't
they're
need
like
to worry about them.
right. Hardcore history itself. They do 2 or 3 or 4 part series. Each are about 3 hours long. Like they did one on the First World War, which I think was 6 3-hour parts long. They did one on the entire history of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The first one was about 3 hours long, and half of it was setting up the geopolitics of Bronze Age Mesopotamia. The point, however, is great podcast, but they did an addendum podcast series. It's a separate channel, and they have this addendum series where they have shorter one-off podcasts, which are only about an hour, 2 hours long. And the one addendum on alternative history was Caesar at Hastings. And it was the army that Julius Caesar brought over to Britain in 50 BC or 58 BC. I can't remember when he did it, but it was 50 something BC. The army he brought over in that time versus the army of William the Conqueror. I won't tell you how it ended up, but watch it.
It does sound like that sounds like a battle you should play in Total War.
Well, funnily enough, the impetus for it was actually tabletop wargaming, historical tabletop wargaming. And it was the idea of, I'll very quickly run through it. The idea was people used to play tabletop war games in the 70s and 80s using real historical armies. And it was very rare that you would actually come up against an opponent who had an army from a contemporaneous historical time. You'd have people with ancient Egyptian armies facing off against people with Napoleonic armies. And the idea was that up until about 1850, 1860s, and up until about the American Civil War, you could pretty much balance most armies against each other, and it was only after the American Civil War, or maybe the Napoleonic Wars, that warfare began to develop so rapidly that you couldn't possibly compare two military forces from different time periods. The German army of the Franco-Prussian War would be defeated very easily by the German army of the First World War, and the German army of the Second World War would easily defeat the German army of the First World War. And all of the combatants of the Second World War would be beaten by 1 or 2 divisions of the US Army today. That led to the argument, well, what if you had 2 armies of vastly different time periods facing off in a battle? And the narrator, there's only ever one narrator, his name is Dan Carden or something. He basically had this argument, well, how about you have 2 armies who found themselves in the same place at different times? Caesar, and then 1,000 years later, William. They both found themselves in Hastings, or Sussex in general, leading armies invading Britain. What if Caesar arrived first, and then a few months after him, William arrived? And what if they'd faced off at Hastings? And then the argument, and the whole podcast extends from that. And it was really interesting as a thought experiment, which is what alternative history is. It's a thought experiment about historical causation. It's time travel, essentially. What if you go back and change the past?
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to end it. Thank you for watching this edition of the History Channel's
Special edition.
special edition of the History Channel's new series of Pawn Stars. We have no idea what the next episode will be, or even if there will be one, because who knows these days. Actually, what will it be? Oh, it'll be Carolin's in Europe, probably. Anyway, from all of us here at the History Channel, goodbye.